If you've read much of the Gospels, it may surprise you how many times Jesus' 12 disciples disagreed with each other. Very first ones. There's a sense in which you can think of those first disciples who followed Jesus through Palestine as a preview of the church that would be born at Pentecost shortly after. The things that they experienced as they walked behind their rabbi are very much like the things that we experience as we walk behind him today. And they disagreed with each other, and maybe more amazingly, they disagreed with Jesus at times. You can't be right if you disagree with Jesus. Luke chapter 9, we read, "An argument arose among them." These are the progenitors of the Christian church, the very first, the pillars. An argument, and you would think, an argument about what? How best to take care of the poor? How best to get Jesus to everyone who needs healing? How best to organize that and take care of others? No. We wish it was so. As to which of them was the greatest? Now, they had the benefit of having Jesus physically with them, and he set them straight. And so I'm sure that was the last time they ever fought with each other about something as silly as that. Oh, no. Here's Luke 22. "A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest." Those disciples disagreed with each other. Amazingly, they disagreed with Jesus too. And Peter was willing to disagree with Jesus out loud, as he was willing to do most things out loud. So when Jesus said he was going to Jerusalem to die, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." What I want to point out to you is that disagreements are a part of life. They've always been. They're not just a part of life, they're a part of the Christian life. And they're a part of the Christian life in the church. It's been that way since the very beginning with the disciples themselves. If men as great as the apostles would become had disagreements among themselves, you and I should not be surprised if we ourselves have disagreements among ourselves as we do. Actually, there's a sense in which disagreements are built into the nature of the Christian church. You know, if God had called to himself a people from only one subsection of Judaism, for example, if he had taken for himself people who were all alike in their background, in their history, in the way that they thought, in their politics and everything, then it would be much easier not to disagree. But it is the nature of what God's doing in this world that he has called to himself Jew and Gentile. He has called to himself people who are very, very different from one another. And when you take people who are very different from one another and put them in close proximity, you then have disagreements. So you ought to expect disagreements to arise, and we Christians are not those who never disagree with each other. That would be a little bit cult-like. But we are those who can disagree with each other and yet remain, quote, "of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind." What keeps us Christians together is not any natural affinities that we have. It's not personalities that are identical. It's not that we all think and see the world in exactly the same way. What keeps us together is a kind of covenant loyalty. And that covenant loyalty is what we're seeing and talking about in our passage today. David and Jonathan are men who had entered into a covenant. It happened right after David had killed Goliath. Jonathan took him aside. They entered into a covenant. It's very important that they had entered that covenant because today, David and Jonathan, surprise, surprise, encounter a fierce disagreement. But the way they handle their disagreement is in a way that is aware of the covenant that they had entered in together. And that is the way that you and I are called to disagree well in the local church. Covenant disagreements. David has been running away from Saul, that's Jonathan's father, who's been trying to kill him. Jonathan, on his part, last he heard from his father, Saul had said he was not going to kill David. So Jonathan thinks that his father's not going to kill David, and David is certain that he wants to kill him. That's the disagreement. It is a matter of life and death. It's not a minor disagreement, but they weather the disagreement well because of their covenant loyalty to each other. So let's see this here. 1 Samuel 20, we're starting in the first verse. Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" And he said to him, "Far from it. You shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? It's not so." But David vowed again, saying, "Your father knows well that I have found favor in your eyes." And he thinks, "Don't let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death." Then Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you say, I'll do for you." David said to Jonathan, "Behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit at table with the king. But let me go, that I may hide myself in the field till the third day at evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, 'David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem his city, for there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the clan.' If he says, 'Good,' it will be well with your servant. But if he's angry, then know that harm is determined by him. Therefore deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there's guilt in me, kill me yourself. For why should you bring me to your father?" And Jonathan said, "Far be it from you. If I knew that it was determined by my father that harm should come to you, would I not tell you?" Now, we can acknowledge up front right away that our circumstance today is not identical to the circumstance of David and Jonathan. For one thing, David is a general in Israel, and Jonathan is the crown prince. That is different. They had cut a covenant with one another that's not identical to the covenant that we've cut with each other. We will talk about that. But still, as Romans 15:4 says, whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction. There is enough overlap between David and Jonathan's disagreement and our disagreements that we can find here helpful principles for how to disagree, which is what we will be doing today. Of course, if you spent any time at all in the local church, any local church, this one or another, you will disagree. There will be disagreements. There's no way to avoid that. Our goal, though, is to handle the disagreements well, and this passage helps us to do it. I want to summarize the way that we are to disagree with this phrase, covenant disagreement. That's what you find between David and Jonathan. Let's begin by just looking at the disagreement, and then we'll move to the covenant piece of it. Start with disagreement here. Observe, first of all, from this passage that they happen even between friends as close as David and Jonathan. Remember, David and Jonathan are such close friends that they are one of the most prominent historical examples of a friendship ever in the world. And yet here in our passage, they have a disagreement. This is common. If you read the Bible, you see disagreements often. I already mentioned the disciples with their disagreements. Paul disagreed with Peter, the apostle, publicly, even after Jesus had gone to heaven. Paul disagreed so sharply with Barnabas, they parted ways. Paul had to write to the Philippian church and urge Euodia and Syntyche, co-workers in the Lord, to agree in the Lord, to get along. So I suppose it's really obvious just to say that in our passage, there's a disagreement. But I think it's important to point that out so that Satan doesn't make you think that when you enter into disagreements in the church, you're in some odd circumstance. This has always been happening. It will happen to you. It has happened to you. It will happen to you. Now, you might be tempted to think, well, My circumstances are different. The disagreements I'm dealing with in the church are big and overwhelming, and their disagreement, they just work through it within a page. But I want to point out to you the intensity and the strength of David and Jonathan's disagreement here. Look again at these first 3 verses. And David fled from Naioth and Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" And he said to him, "Far from it. You shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? It is not so." But David vowed again, saying, "Your father knows well that I've found favor in your eyes." And he thinks, "Do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death." These are some strong words. Starting with David, you have his rhetorical questions that he's asking there. What have I done? What is my guilt? What is my sin before your father that he seeks my life? It suggests to us a real desperateness on David's part. Apparently, this constituted a vow of some kind, or maybe he made a vow with it, because if you look at verse 3, it says he vowed again. So 2 vows. He's speaking firmly, very firmly here. He guesses at Saul's motive. Then he continues, "But truly, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives," there's the second vow, "there is but a step between me and death." That is a strong word picture. Death is breathing down his shoulder. What's interesting is David is speaking very firmly. Jonathan on his end is speaking very firmly, but saying the opposite thing. Verse 2, he says, "Far from it." It's like the me genoita of Romans. Far from it, may it never be. And then Jonathan has his own rhetorical question. Why should my father hide this from me? And then finally he just puts it plainly. It is not so. These covenantal brothers both have their heels in the ground, and they disagree, and it's not a minor disagreement. It's very strong. And if it happened to them, it will happen to us. You can see that here. Disagreements happen. That's simply the first thing we want to point out here. Now, we do want to consider the reasons for the disagreement between them. Why does this disagreement arise? And you may feel that in the church. You think you're around people who are so like-minded. We all love the Lord. Why would we come to have strong disagreements? David and Jonathan had souls that resonated with one another. That's what drew them together. How could they have such a strong disagreement? The primary reason in our passage for their disagreement is ignorance. Ignorance on Jonathan's part. That's why they disagreed. Probably the last that Jonathan had heard his father speak of David, it was that oath in verse 6 of the last chapter when Saul said, "As the Lord lives, he, David, shall not be put to death." Now you and I know, and David knows, that between that and verse 6 of the last chapter, Saul has tried to kill David 3 times. Once with a spear, once by trapping him in his house, once by chasing him to Ramah. You know that because you read it. David knows that because he lived it. But Jonathan does not know that. And it's for the reason that David rightly guessed. Your father knows well I found favor in your eyes. And he thinks, don't let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. So Jonathan is not set maliciously against David. He loves him. But there is an ignorance on Jonathan's part. He doesn't have the complete picture. That's where their disagreement is coming from. You can see there's nothing malicious in Jonathan in verse 9. He says, "If I knew that it was determined by my father that harm should come to you, would I not tell you?" Now, most of our disagreements, many of the facts set before you, we know what the picture is. But usually in the church, when you have a disagreement, both sides think they see the whole picture. That's why there's a disagreement. They're seeing things differently here. But somebody's not seeing it all. One or both of the parties, there's an ignorance there leading to the disagreement. Now, there is another reason for our disagreements. It's not featured prominently in this passage, but it's sin. We disagree because of ignorance, but we also disagree because of sin. Actually, in this passage, it's not David or Jonathan's sin, it's actually Saul's sin. But for most of us, when we come to a disagreement, our own sin is a factor in the conflict that's taking place. Maybe more pointedly, it's our pride. It's our pride that sets us against each other. This is why there's a very beautiful passage in 1 Peter chapter 5 talking about the way that elders and those they lead are to interact with one another. And Peter, as a co-elder, writes to the elders first and tells them to be humble in interacting with those they lead. He says, I exhort the elders among you, shepherd the flock of God that's among you, exercising oversight, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. That's what he tells to the elders of a church. Then he looks at the congregation and he says, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. And then he looks at everyone, elders and those who are being led, and he says, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Now, David and Jonathan disagreed. You will disagree among each other. Sometimes you may disagree with us as leaders, and we may disagree with you as those who are being led. Why? Why would that happen? Ignorance and sin. And trust me, although I'm speaking as an elder, I don't just mean your ignorance and sin. We contribute. We contribute on our end. Ignorance and sin. Those get in the way. That's why on our end as elders, the humility is necessary to be able to listen, to change our thinking if it's wrong, to be able to really hear. On your end, to be willing to submit to our leadership, even when you don't agree with it. Ignorance and sin are causes for disagreement. In our passage, it's Saul's sin, but especially it's the ignorance piece. That's why David and Jonathan are disagreeing. Jonathan is ignorant of what is happening. So there's the disagreement. Now we need to move to what do you do when you face a disagreement? Because David and Jonathan handle theirs very, very well. And again, like I said, this is not a minor disagreement. It is literally life and death. If David cannot convince Jonathan, David's own life will be imperiled. So this is very serious. Jonathan has just outright denied David's experience of being hunted by Saul, something that obviously is meaningful and frightening to David. And Jonathan has simply said, it's not so. So this is a big disagreement. This could explode. This could split their friendship. But notice, it doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't have to, and it doesn't. And that is because their disagreement is a covenant disagreement. Let's consider the covenant piece now. Look once more at the plot that David hatches, starting in verse 4. Then Jonathan said to David, whatever you say, I will do for you. David said to Jonathan, behold, tomorrow's the new moon, and I should not fail to sit at table with the king. But let me go, that I may hide myself in the field till the third day at evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city, for there's a yearly sacrifice there for all the clan. If he says, good, it will be well with your servant. But if he's angry, then know that harm is determined by him. Therefore, deal kindly with your servant, for you've brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there's guilt in me, kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father? And Jonathan said, far be it from you. If I knew that it was determined by my father that harm should come to you, would I not tell you? Covenant is the way they get through this disagreement, and it's the way that you and I get through our disagreements too. But I think we can be more specific. I think really the way they work through their disagreement comes down to 3 F's. Faithfulness, forbearance, and fact-checking. See, F's, that's easy to remember, right? But that's what you find in this passage. There's a faithfulness, a forbearance, and a fact-checking. Just start with faithfulness. Really, The reason that David and Jonathan can push through their strong disagreement is because even before the disagreement arises, they had pre-committed to each other's good. The covenant, which is pointed out, it was back in chapter 18, after David killed Goliath, we read, then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. David in this passage points back to that covenant in verse 8. Deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. Meaning they in chapter 18 had made a commitment to each other, and it was so strong that even before they entered into a disagreement, they knew they were going to work through this disagreement together. There was a prior commitment. There was a faithfulness to each other. Actually, in verse 8 there, when it says deal kindly, literally it says do hesed. If you know your Old Testament very well, hesed is the most important, perhaps single word in the Old Testament. It's covenant, loyalty, or faithfulness. God shows hesed to us. He's faithful to us because we're in covenant with him. We ought to be faithful to him because we're in covenant with him. In this case, he's urging Jonathan, do hesed to me. Show loyalty and faithfulness to me, and let's work through this disagreement together. Now, you and I, we have all entered into a covenant with each other. I don't know if you are aware of that, but Jesus inaugurated a new covenant in his blood. You are part of the new covenant, as I am as well. We are in a covenantal relationship with each other. That's true of you and all believers. When you enter into membership in a local church, if you're a member of this church, that's another degree of what I would consider really a covenantal relationship. You are making commitments. You come up on stage and you make a series of commitments. They are beforehand commitments that you will strive to work in harmony, the leadership with each other. You will use your gifts. You're committing that beforehand. Now, you don't know what kind of issues there are going to be in the future, but you're saying before the issues even arise, you are committing yourselves to every other member of this church and to following the leadership of the church as well. You and I have a prior commitment to each other. And I would say that that commitment to each other, if we're not talking about primary theological matters like the doctrine of the Trinity or heretical aberrations away from the gospel, when it comes to secondary matters or third-level matters, our commitment to each other ought to be more important than me getting you to see things exactly how I see them. Now, we will get to the fact that David wants Jonathan to see things the way he sees them. But there's a prior commitment. There is a faithfulness that they have to each other. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand. This isn't a kind of good old boys network where you can get away with anything. We're just committed to each other. The substance of the disagreements don't even matter. Push them aside. We're not saying that at all. That's not what happens in this passage either. In fact, what's interesting is there in verse 8, he says, if there is guilt in me, kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father? Our prior commitment to each other in covenant is not that I will overlook all your sins and you'll overlook all of mine. There are some disagreements that require church discipline as a process when we dig into sin. We do not simply say, well, it's just a disagreement if you're living with your boyfriend or your girlfriend. No, if there is chapter and verse, we do confront sin. So don't misunderstand that. But I would say most of our disagreements in the church are not that level of disagreement. They have a bit more nuance to them. And it is our prior commitment to each other that gets us through them. Our disagreements can get complicated. You have a disagreement with someone? They get complicated. But we are committed to each other. We will work through it. So faithfulness is the first way David and Jonathan work through their disagreement. Secondly, there's a forbearance, and it goes both ways in our passage. When Jonathan just outright denies David's experience, in verse 2, notice how David replies. There's no venom. There's no angry outburst here. There's nothing unkind, actually, in David's response. Even though Jonathan's ignorance is jeopardizing David's life, David is really willing to forbear with Jonathan. David's willing to organize a test in our passage to help Jonathan come to a place of agreement with him, even though it's going to take multiple days to do it. He doesn't demand, no, just believe me right now, agree right now, and let's move on. He says, well, let's work together to figure this out. So there's forbearing happening on David's end. And notice on Jonathan's end too, there's a forbearing. That's how they work through it, even though Jonathan is confident that David is wrong and feels strongly that David is wrong. He still says, what do you want me to do? I'll do it. How can we work through this together and figure out what's really going on? He's willing to forbear with David as well. And finally, there is a fact-checking, which is important as well. The last chapter, Jonathan actually had come up with a plot for how to discern what Saul was really thinking. Now, David's coming up with a very similar plot to figure out what Saul's really thinking. Now, it involves a new moon. Just so you know, the Jewish people operate on a lunar calendar. We operate on a solar calendar. So for them, every time the moon would go invisible and you would start then just to see the first sliver of it, that would be a new moon. Easier than a solar calendar. You could be a farmer and just look up and know it's a new moon. That was important because God had commanded his people when there was a new moon, there was meant to be a sacrifice, blowing of trumpets, a kind of celebration, a feast. That's what's happening in our passage. It is a new moon. And so Saul is having a multiple day feast. The plot involves that. David, as Saul's general, is expected to be there. So David comes up with this plan to fact check. The disagreement is about what is Saul really intending. They're going to fact check what he's really intending. And notice this is not just for Jonathan's sake. I think David himself was probably open to the possibility that Saul, fickle as he was, had again changed his mind and was not seeking out his harm. We don't want to fact check in a way that's just biased to our own conclusions, just to prove that we're right. It's not what he does. Look at verse 7. If he says good, that's possible, it'll be well with your servant. Good. In that case, Jonathan's right. But if he's angry, then know that harm is determined by him. In that case, David's right. And we really ought to follow their example and do what we can to get a bigger picture. If you come into a disagreement with someone, it does require quite a degree of humility to be willing to be wrong. Oh, it is so hard to be wrong. So hard to be wrong. None of us wants to. But here there's an openness on both of their ends. Whatever the facts are, they will let the facts stand. They will let the facts be the facts, even if they contradict their point of view. The interest is just getting to the bottom of what's really going on with Saul. And we have to do the same thing, asking wisdom from God in our disagreements. There then is the way that we disagree with each other. Disagreements, you'll have them, but covenant disagreements, where we are faithful to each other, we forbear with each other, we fact check as far as we can. Listen, we're not going to do that perfectly, but I do want you to bear in mind that the peace we enjoy as Christians as we work through our disagreements well is something Jesus won for us on the cross. And he ought to have the reward of his suffering. As Paul says to the Ephesians, he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. Jesus has won it by his death on the cross, that you and I would work through our disagreements like David and Jonathan because of our covenant commitment to one another, and so far as it depends on us, to be at peace. Let's pray.